Okay, so as I mentioned in my lecture yesterday, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about copyright as we move into this final project where some of you may be using imagery that you're creating or found imagery or combining images. I want to make sure that we all have a good sense of what falls within the guidelines of proper usage of images by respecting copyright law. Copyright is a complicated and evolving area of the law. It's very complicated. People have degrees just in this. So I'm going to give you a quick overview that will hopefully help guide your decision making, but this is by no means an exhaustive investigation of copyright or its use in the arts. So on the most basic level, copyright is the exclusive right to control, reproduction, and commercial exploitation of your creative work. In the United States, images and artwork are automatically copyrighted and property of the artist. You can go through a process to register the work, but you do not have to. The moment you draw something, take a photo, do any kind of creative work, you own that as the artist. We're certainly becoming more and more used to seeing stories like this where people on Instagram or, in various other types of media are coming up against copyright claims. Part of that is because we have more access than ever before to tracking down these kinds of potential infringements. People are seeing more and more images so they can be more inspired by things. But people are also just sharing images freely, and that can also complicate copyright law in this day and age. So the first example I want to talk a little bit in depth about is this photograph right here, which some of you may or may not have seen. This image went viral, I think it was the late 2000s, as the monkey selfie. This is an image of a monkey named Naruto who lived, I think, in an Indonesian wildlife park where a nature photographer went to photograph the animals. He set up his camera on a tripod and was shooting the animals. And at some point, this monkey got very curious about what was happening, walked up to the camera, stood in front of it, and actually pressed the shutter. So there's a funny video about this that you can watch. I have the link written down there, but if you just Google, monkey selfie lawsuit, you can find something. Essentially, WikiCommons posted that photo. The photographer who had, been the nature photographer in question asked them to take it down because he owned the copyright. WikiCommons said, "We don't think you own the copyright because a monkey took this photo." And then PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, jumped in and decided they wanted to get involved in this lawsuit. So we ended up in a complicated legal situation that there wasn't much precedent for. It's a pretty interesting case because, one, it's kind of hilarious. This photo is pretty funny, and the idea that a monkey suing for copyright is coming to court is funny. But it also brings up some issues and some holes in copyright law. There were sort of three, again, interested parties in this case. You had WikiCommons, who were trying to post this image, and Wikimedia is, of course, an organization that's trying to create free information on the internet that wants people to have access to knowledge and images, and that's, of course, something very amiable. PETA got involved because they wanted to extend the fundamental rights of animals and limit exploitation of animals. In this particular case, we're talking about an endangered species. So again, this is a very positive or a good goal for them to have. And then the photographer, David Slater, felt like photographers were under enough pressure to make a living. They don't need crazy new interpretations of the laws. He just wants to protect his rights as an artist. So one of the interesting things about this case is you have three very good points that are coming into contrast with each other. Ultimately, the case was settled out of court with the David Slater, the photographer, agreeing to give some percentage of his proceeds to animal conservation. Um, and again, because this was settled out of court, we don't have necessarily a clear answer. Overall, it was basically a loss for PETA and a protection for the rights of artists. This whole issue came up, and this is one of my favorite memes, which is why I put it in this slide, even though I'm sure you guys think I'm a huge dork for this. The whole issue around this is a level of sharing that can happen in the digital age that we're not used to. The fact that that photo went viral, the fact that it popped up on WikiCommons, the fact that PETA had access to it, the fact that its reproduction and exploitation spread so rapidly, those are all facets of the digital age, things that our legal system, that our laws have not fully caught up with. They haven't completely been able to contend that. This is a stupid meme about Photoshop. If he's 28 years old, can be hard to work with, sometimes quits on you, hasn't recovered from the past, is forced on you, he's not your man, he's Adobe Photoshop. But of course, the point here is we can change and redistribute and edit and do things to images that were unimaginable a fairly short amount of time ago. So as an artist, as someone who's working with images, who's coming up against copyright restrictions, it's important that you're educated about how these things work, about what the rules are, and how you can both be careful but also understand and utilize the tools and the protections that are afforded to you as a creative person. So mostly what I'm talking about today is copyright law in the United States. Of course, copyright varies internationally a great deal. There are places where copyright doesn't really exist. There are places where copyright is different set of circumstances. But in the United States, copyright protection, again, is automatic for creative works, and it lasts for 70 years after the artist's death. After something comes out of copyright, so this being the year 2020, if an artist died in 1940, their work is going to come out of copyright this year. I'm sorry, I can't do math. That would be 1950. At that point, work becomes available for use, and that's known as being in the public domain. Many of you in high school probably saw school plays or concerts using very old music, very old plays. You can do Shakespeare without having to pay the artist because he has been dead so long. If you go to Trader Joe's, a lot of their graphics are these kind of kooky, old-fashioned woodcut style images. A lot of those are probably in the public domain, and they don't have to pay to purchase images or stock images. So if you're going to use very old imagery or copy or interpret something from a long time ago, that is a fair use of copyright, formerly copyrighted material. So here are two artworks by Pablo Picasso. The one on the left was made in 1913. The one on the right was made the year of his death, 1973. And I show both of these works because it's important to remember that they expire 70 years after his death. It doesn't matter that one was made 60 years prior to the other. They will both expire at the same time. So when you are looking at artworks, you want to really be thinking longer term. Just because something was made 70 years ago doesn't mean it's out of copyright. If you go way back to, the 1500s, you're going to be good. But if you're looking at something in the 19th, 20th century, it's possible that it's still under copyright. So you need to really do your homework if you're looking to use copyrighted material that is somewhat recent. So one thing I often hear from students when I'm teaching this class, when I'm teaching a digital class, is that they want to take an image they found online, make some changes, maybe trace it, maybe just stylize it a bit, or vectorize it, make it into an illustration. And I always ask if people think this is okay or not. So you can think about your decision right now. In terms of copyright, this is not an okay use. Again, there are things that could sort of fall into gray areas, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But what's happening here is that the artwork, the image, is not really being transformed in its meaning or in its use. It is still a portrait of a dude. It's still very similar, and just because the medium or the style of it has changed a bit, that doesn't mean it's a new artwork. If you do want to make an illustration from a photograph, you can either take the photograph yourself, you can purchase the photograph from one of a jillion stock photo sites, you can go to a free image bank. A lot of government images are free, Wikicommons, they're free stock websites, etc. But again, just transforming something visually is not enough for you to be creating a new artwork. This would be considered a violation of copyright, and if the artist were to track you down, they could talk to a lawyer, send you a cease and desist letter, potentially sue you. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. The image sources that I recommend for all of you, if you're looking for source imagery, if you want to do a woodcut of a dog and you're looking for a photograph of a dog that you can draw from, the most clear-cut things for you to work from would be first images in the public domain. So anything that has either been released from copyright, something can be put into the public domain by the artist. If the artist says, hey, I want this to be free and shared, they can release it from copyright. Or again, something that is aged out. And of course, remembering that we're talking about it aging out 70 years after the death of the author. Again, sometimes there are ways for entities to extend a copyright, so it is a little bit dicey. But things that are really old, hundreds of years old, are generally going to be fine. You can purchase an image or a stock photo. There's a million stock photo websites. I'm sure you all have seen Getty Images or Shutterstock, all these kinds of places where you can buy photos. In many cases, you can buy things for a small nominal fee. There are, of course, expensive ways to license imagery as well. Another place where there are a lot of great images that you can have access to for free is through the US government, and that's because all of that is taxpayer funded. So images taken by NASA are all released into the public domain. They have a wonderful image bank on their website and on their Flickr page. You paid for that, so if you want to use those images, go for it. Another option is to get written permission from the creator. So if you follow an artist on Instagram and you see an image that you think is awesome and you want to adapt it into a print, send them a DM. If you get in writing that they are fine with you using their imagery, that works. Again, this doesn't have to be a formal notarized letter. This can be an email, a DM, any kind of message that's written down. And then the last thing I like to mention to students is that they can self-create. We all have access nowadays to incredibly powerful cameras and digital tools in our pockets. If you want an image of a hand giving a thumbs up, you can literally just do that and take a picture of it. One thing I didn't mention under purchased images and stock photos was, again, your free stock photo site. So a couple of really popular ones nowadays are Pixabay, Pixaby, or Pexels, Pexels, and there are a ton of images there available for your use. I know that Google Image Search does have a tab where you can select copyright permissions when you're searching for images. I think that's fine, but that, like, getting a source from Wikipedia, that's step one. Step two is to follow up and make sure that that image is in fact available for your use, because as we know, these things get tagged in all sorts of different ways by people, and there's not a lot of follow-up all the time. Okay, so if you do not want to, or if you're thinking about using images beyond what we talked about on the last slide, there are some provisions in U.S. copyright law that allow for the use of copyrighted material. Fair use is what we call this doctrine, and it's a little bit of a complicated legal term. It's something that has greatly been shaped by case law. So, not necessarily legislated with clear laws written out, but something that is shaped over time by court cases. Um, the point of fair use is to allow copyrighted material to be quoted for criticism, news reporting, teaching, research, without the need for permission. Fair use is basically a form of protected free speech. If we were not able to ever quote anyone in the classroom, if we were not able to, poke fun at politicians, etc., that would be infringing on our free speech. So there are certain specific instances that allow us to use copyrighted material. And I'm going to go into those a little bit more in detail. I definitely recommend, if this is a topic that interests you, read a little bit about fair use. The College Art Association has some great resources on their website that talk about fair use, in particular its use in artistic and creative work. Again, it's a complicated topic, but it's very interesting. So fair use is often said to have four prongs, and this varies a little bit depending on how you categorize it. But the four I want to kind of focus on today would be: first, something that is changing the purpose of the original work. So if you're taking an artwork and you're simply making another artwork from it, that doesn't change the purpose of the original work. If you take something and you are commenting on it, if you're satirizing it, if you're raising questions or transforming it in a really original way, that could potentially be covered under fair use, and we'll look at examples of that. The second is the fact that something being categorized as fair use should not, or I'm sorry, copyright should not limit the use of facts or ideas conveyed by original work. So, if I want to quote a statistic from a scientific study, I can use that exact verbiage because it's just straight facts. If I can say the sky is blue, and that's not a phrase that can be copyrighted because it's just factual information. And in order for us to communicate and exist in our society, that has to exist. Another thing that sort of falls under this is very vague or general phrases. There have been some lawsuits where people have sued because lyrics were, potentially copied from a previous song, and courts have ruled that something very vague like "Baby, I love you" or something like that, that would be used frequently in a song, can't be copyrighted. So, another prong in number two. Number three would be the amount of the original work used. So if you're using a small excerpt, or if you're combining a piece of something with a lot of other images or ideas, that works. But as we saw with that photograph to vector illustration, if you're doing something that's just taking the original image, using all of it, and not, adding or subtracting or changing it, that isn't going to work under fair use. And the fourth thing to think about with fair use is the effect that the new work has on the market value of the original. So, for example, if I take an image and I put it on a mug and sell it, that's very different than if I put an image in my PowerPoint presentation to teach a class. If I put an image up on the wall of a nonprofit institution or in an educational space. So, market value is certainly important. Here's a piece I made for the UCSB library a year or two ago. And this was a piece that I was invited to respond to a show they were making around the 50th anniversary of the Santa Barbara oil spill. And this is a piece I like to show just to give you guys a sense of what I'm making. Also, to talk about my engagement with copyright and fair use. It's something that I'm very interested in and connected to because it's something I'm thinking about a lot in my work. This piece took hundreds of images from the internet and collaged them together. They're all images of the finish known as oil slick, which is, of course, something that's very beautiful, that's referring to ecological disaster. A lot of these images are petroleum products, and obviously, oil slick or oil spills are petroleum based disasters. So I was exploring some of the duality of the beauty in the ugliness of this finish. And of course, when you see oil on the ground or spilled oil, you experience the same situation where you know it's toxic, but it's also very visually attractive. So for me, this is a piece that I consider to be falling under fair use for a number of reasons. The first is its purpose is educational. This was not a commercial work. It was hung in the library. It was not to be sold or reproduced. So even though I was pulling these images off of Google Images, all of these images are probably under copyright. I wasn't affecting their market value. The second reason is I was taking portions of many images and combining them. So if I were to take any one of these objects and print it out and blow it up, that wouldn't be transforming it. But when taken in a context, it becomes part of a larger whole. It becomes an existing in comparison to all these other things. It's transforming the meaning. It's taking a singular image and making it part of a collage. The third reason that this is covered under fair use, and this is what we're going to talk about next, is that it's commenting on something. So I'm using these images to talk about a political issue. I'm using these images to talk about ecological disaster, about environmentalism, about consumerism. And that's one of the most important parts of fair use, is transforming the meaning and doing so in a way that needs to be protected by free speech. So political commentary, satire, anything like that is going to be covered under fair use. So parody is an important prong of fair use. You guys have certainly seen on Saturday Night Live when they use actual icons from networks or products or whatever, when they quote politicians or use people's exact words. And that's because parody is political free speech. In order to be able to make fun of the president or corporations or any political entity, the ability to use their name, use their logo, use the words that they've said has to be protected. So when you're thinking about your work, if you're taking something from a commercial realm and bringing it into a political realm, if you're poking fun at any kind of political or important hegemonic figure, then that is likely to fall under fair use. Here's one particular court case that is taking, I don't want to say taking advantage, but that is dealing with this issue of parody as being free speech. Basically, a candidate from one party took an image that was being used by a candidate for the other party and made a political ad that was parodying the other candidate's ad. And it was ruled that this was considered free speech because it was criticism, parody, it's protected speech. So I think it was the RNC that funded this, was allowed to use an image that was under copyright without payment because they were doing so in a way that was free political speech. This again can exist not just with politics in particular, but also folks who are trying to point the finger at other major entities and talk about political issues. This is from an Instagram account called Marks of the Beast, where the artist takes logos from various corporate entities and transforms the meaning to have some kind of a political topic. So, for example, we see the Little Debbie logo and it's been changed to be about diabetes. So, we're taking this exact image of a major entity, but we're raising questions about it. We're turning it on its head. We're creating a parody. We're saying, here is a corporation that's using high fructose corn syrup and farm subsidies and all these things and making people sick. Again, this is political speech. It's transforming the meaning. So even though that image is not visually that transformed, its meaning is completely transformed. If we go back to the example I showed you of the photograph being changed into a vectorized image, The meaning of that image was not transformed. It was visually changed, but its meaning stayed the same. It was still a portrait of a dude. Whereas here, even though the image has not been changed hardly at all, the meaning has been completely transformed from something that's supposed to be happy and fun and make you want to eat Twinkies to something that is revealing the dark nature of various power structures in our society. Another one of my favorite Instagram parody accounts, Real McDonald's, where again they use the actual McDonald's M, they use their fonts and their styles to again make fun of various social issues, economic issues, corporate power in our society. So, moving on to some artworks that have come up against copyright issues and fair use issues. The first one I want to talk about as an example is a Jeff Koons sculpture, which you see on top, which was based on a photograph. And so folks see this and they see that it's been transformed into color. It's been taken from 2D in black and white and been put into 3D in color, that there have been stylizations to the way that this artwork has been presented. If you had to guess, take a guess in your mind if Jeff Koons, the sculptor who made the image on top, was allowed when he was brought to court to consider this fair use. The answer is no, he was not. This is because there wasn't that transformation of meaning. We still have this fun, cute, kitschy Americana kind of image. It's not making a commentary. It's not transforming this image. It's not changing it, turning it on its head. If I'm just thinking off the cuff here, perhaps if we had two dogs holding a whole bunch of human babies and it was a comment on animal rights, that would be considered fair use. But in this case, Koons had to pay the original photographer, and I'm not sure the fate of the work, if the work had to be destroyed or returned or anything, or if it was just a cut of the profits. Again, when I say it was not allowed or it was illegal or the court struck it down, that can mean a lot of things. It can mean the artist had to cease and desist. It can mean some sort of payment or economic reparation had to be paid to the original artist. It can mean that, the artist took a hit to their reputation. So it's a complicated situation. It's generally not like people being sent to jail. It's mostly a civil matter. So the exact repercussions of breaking copyright law can be a little bit confusing and unclear. So while we're on the topic of Jeff Koons, who is an artist that uses a lot of found imagery in his work, I wanted to show another example of a time that he was brought to court for using found imagery. Here we have on the left the original photograph, which was an advertising image for the shoes, and then a painting that he made on the right. And so I wonder here if folks think that this was okay, in the court's opinion or not. The answer is that this piece was considered okay when it was brought to court. Again, we have different judges, different lawyers, different sets of circumstances. It's hard to know exactly what happens in any one particular court case. But here we have a situation where the image was taken, combined with a lot of other images, and a painting was created that's sort of about beauty and consumerism, food and beautiful women and expensive fashion. So there's some sort of political or cultural statement being made, and the original image, simply being a catalog advertisement for these shoes, had a very different meaning. So again, using an image as a small piece of a larger artwork and transforming its meaning allowed the courts to give Jeff Koons a pass in this case, unlike the other case where he didn't transform the meaning, even though it was visually arguably much more different than in this case. Again, all four of these here together, and I do want to just hammer home the point that it's not about how different something looks necessarily, it's much more about the meaning and the content. I'm sure all of you have seen this, the Obama Hope poster. And as you may or may not know, this poster was also at the center of a copyright claim. The original image was shot by the Associated Press. It was actually shot by a photographer who was working for the Associated Press, the news agency. The artist Shepard Fairey then took this image and created an illustration from it. And the famous Hope poster that we all know now came out of this project. The Associated Press eventually took Shepard Fairey to court over this, and then the photographer who took the original image jumped in on this legal battle because he was like, hey, wait a minute, just because my employer pays my salary, you know, I also need to be compensated in this case. So again, it was a complicated legal situation with three parties. And a lot of these cases are not very cut and dry. They'll have multiple interested parties. There will be various complications. And that was certainly the case in this lawsuit. When the photograph was revealed and the photographer came forward, this lawsuit developed. And eventually the parties settled out of court. The details were confidential, but we could sort of consider this a loss for Shepard Fairey. He had to pay a bunch of money. However, a big part of his loss was the fact that during the case it was revealed that he had destroyed evidence. So it wasn't just that the content was bad, it was that Shepard Fairey had engaged in illegal activities during this lawsuit, which reflected obviously very poorly on his case. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember as we talk about copyright being shaped a great deal by case law. Case law involves individual actors, individual judges, individual lawyers, individual defendants, and other folks. And none of those people are perfect. People make mistakes, people screw up, people do stupid things. In this case, Shepard Fairey did a really stupid thing by destroying and fabricating documents during this legal battle, and that is reflected in the lawsuit. One interesting situation in this lawsuit that I think I sort of misspoke on in the last slide is that Fairey was actually the one who brought this case to the courts. He wanted to extend the rights of artists. He wanted the courts to rule in his favor so that he could push copyright case law in the United States further to be in favor of fair use and artists having rights to interpret and recontextualize imagery. He was again making this poster as political speech. He was doing it in a way where a lot of the money went to the campaign and it wasn't really a moneymaker for him. So the fact that he brought it to the courts is kind of an interesting situation as well. Again, I think a big part of this is that the meaning wasn't transformed. To go back to these two images, we have this very serious kind of heroic image of Obama in front of a flag that has been transformed visually, but is still a serious heroic image of Obama with the colors of the flag. So we're not seeing that meaning transformation. And we're also not seeing it being used as part of a much larger whole or just a small excerpt of this image used. It's really most of the meat of the image is getting used in this poster. There was a fairly interesting video, I think it was on Stephen Colbert. Shepard Fairey was interviewed about this case, and I'm not going to watch it now, but I just wanted to show you guys that this is an option. So you can go ahead and Google this case, because again, it's an interesting case with lots of ins and outs, lots of human error that further muddy up the waters of copyright law. So all in all, this is sort of considered a loss for Shepard Fairey, who did have to settle out of court, who did have to pay a lot of money, and who spent a lot of time, energy, and resources trying to expand copyright law, but had that shut down, at least in part, by his own malfeasance. An important thing for us to note here is that, without getting too political on everyone, the US legal system is in many ways a place where people who have a lot of money have a much better chance of winning. So in Shepard Fairey's case, he purposefully, as a famous rich artist, decided to take on copyright law because he could afford to, because most artists can't. This can also, be the opposite. If you're a small time artist and a big time organization wants to take you down, they can drag out a court case, they can make your life really difficult. And so it's important to know, what your resources are, where you're at in the pecking order, and what you're able to just practically do should a legal battle arise. It's pretty unusual, but there are situations, particularly with Disney, where small time daycare centers or restaurants who have painted a Mickey Mouse mural on the wall have been sued. So it's extremely unlikely that you in this class are going to get tracked down by any kind of major entity and dragged through court, but it's not impossible. And so that's something that I say not to scare you off from utilizing fair use, which is, again, your right under our Constitution, under our laws, your ability to have free speech. But it is important that you're using it thoughtfully, that you're really considering the way that you're operating within copyright law. One really interesting thing that has come out of this Obama poster is the millions of different parodies on that poster. And it's funny that even though the original poster was in violation of copyright, creating new images that make fun of that poster, that comment on politics, or that comment on Shepard Fairey are covered under fair use. So you can sort of get into like a complicated multi-tiered situation where, okay, the original poster was not okay, but if you make a parody of the original poster, you are okay. So again, these waters are muddy. The whole thing is complicated. And I mostly want to just get into some of the basic level issues with all of you so that as you're moving forward creating imagery, you're being really thoughtful about what you're using. So the last example I want to talk about is this poster we see on the right, created by an artist named Esther Hernandez, who took the Sun-Made Raisins box and created this image, Sun Mad. It's a skeleton. On the bottom we see they're unnaturally grown with insecticides, miticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And this here is another example of fair use working right. Because again, even though it's very visually similar, the meaning has been completely transformed. The artist is commenting on corporate, factory farming, on unsustainable practices, on immigrant labor, on the danger of these things to the health of individual people who are harvesting the grapes, and then, of course, down the line, people who are ingesting those things as well. So this is the most important point that I want to hammer home with all of you, is not to focus so much on the visual, but to focus more on the conceptual or the meaning of the image you're using. You can use something that looks exactly like the original that's under copyright, but if you transform its meaning, you're going to be covered under fair use. I may have raised more questions than given you answers in this presentation, which is often something that happens, but the thing that I want you to really consider is just being thoughtful when it comes to image use. It's very easy in this day and age to grab a picture off the internet and make a drawing directly from it, to vectorize the image and consider it an illustration, to use something that's quoted directly and not really transform the meaning. We certainly live in this meme culture nowadays where images are shared all the time without any knowledge about who was the originator or who owns the copyright to this image. So it's a complicated issue that is only getting more and more complicated as we all have more powerful digital tools in our pockets. So, really, the only thing you can do is make sure that you are educated, make sure that you understand fair use, make sure that you understand the basics of copyright, and that you try to operate in a way that is ethical and makes sense for your own practice. Again, in the case of Shepard Fairey, he is rich and famous and he purposefully wanted to take an issue to court so that he could expand the rights for artists. That's totally fine. If your artistic practice is a performance of getting sued for copyright infringement, okay, maybe you're going to go for it. But it's important that you're thoughtful and really considering your choices when you're using images.